Eine Dolmetschung ins Deutsche.
Deutsch auch übersetzt haben. Bitte nutzen Sie die Gelegenheit und holen sich jetzt noch ein Übersetzungsgerät. Thank you very much. Liebe Kara Finke, lieber Bodo von Borries, Members of Advisory Board of Civilian Crisis
Herr von Borries, Mitglieder des Beirats Zivile Krisenprävention und Friedensförderung, Mitglieder des Deutschen Bundestags, meine Damen und Herren. In einem kleinen Dorf im Norden des Südsudan greift ein Mann seinen Nachbar mit einem Speer an.
In northern South Sudan, a man attacks his neighbor with a spear. The victim luckily survives, but he cannot file charges because there's no government-run court in the area. He would like to exact revenge. He could unleash a spiral of violence that could plunge whole families into years of conflict. But the good news was, in this real-life case, the conflict was averted. And this was due to the work of a German public prosecutor. Sabine Arnold advises the judicial authorities in South Sudan as a peacekeeper for the UN mission. An important work of her duty is being placed in a tent. With a team of 30 people, she brings a so-called mobile court to rural areas. And in this tent, the case of the spear attack was finally tried. The perpetrator was convicted and he had to pay several cattle to the victim as compensation. Since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, we have often heard the sentence, "There is no glory in prevention." I think the example from South Sudan shows how wrong this actually is. Prevention is glorious. It may not always cause the biggest headlines, but it keeps people safe. Everyone present here today at this conference knows how civilian instruments like independent courts or efficient police force can prevent violence. That is why they are an essential part of German international security policy. Yes, the war in Ukraine has led to a new focus on interstate conflict in our thinking on security, while our civilian instruments for a long time focused primarily on resolving internal conflicts. But I'm convinced that we need civilian instruments more than ever, and that we need to adapt them now. If we only think of security in military terms, we will not be able to create long-term peace. Our approach to crisis prevention is therefore based on an integrated concept of security. Security means first and foremost the safety of life. Not having to be afraid of being shot on the street or killed by a bomb attack. That is why we are supplying heavy weapons so that Ukraine can defend its citizens. But it's also our civilian instruments that protect people from violence. In Niger, we train police officers who help to keep people safe from terrorists and crimes perpetrated by gangs in the border region. And the example of Sabine Arnold from South Sudan shows that court decisions can help create security as well. Second, security means that people can live in freedom. This year, a German peacekeeper who was on duty in Ukraine for the OSCE mission said to me, I quote, "Peace cannot be forced with weapons, otherwise it's not sustainable." And that's what I had to think about this week when I saw the reports on the sham referendum in Donbass. Under the threat and sometimes even gunpoint, people are being taken out of their homes or workplaces to vote in glass ballot boxes. This is the opposite of free and fair election. And this is the opposite of peace. It's dictated peace. As long as this Russian dictate prevails in the occupied territories of Ukraine, no citizen is safe, no citizen is free. And therefore I'm pleased that we will soon be hearing virtually from Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who continues to bravely oppose the regime in Belarus, because she and many people in Belarus knows better than anyone else there's more to freedom and security than just the absence of war. Third, security means protecting fundamental necessities of our lives, our environment, and our natural resources. When heavy rains in Pakistan flood a third of the country, and a third of the country is actually the size of whole Germany, this shows how much we are endangered of the climate crisis. And by 2050, more than 200 million people worldwide will have to flee their homes because of climate crisis. This shows the security of an entire state can and might be under threat because of climate crisis. And this is not only in Pakistan, this is not only in Ethiopia, this is also in Chile, and this is probably also in European states if we do not tackle the biggest security on earth, the climate crisis. Therefore, climate crisis will be at the core of our crisis prevention. This means that we must actively combat climate change nationally and internationally. And every ton of CO2 matters, because it makes a big difference if we live in a 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees or 3 degrees world. And we are helping those hit hardest by the climate crisis already now, because we are already living in a world of 1.1, almost 1.2 degrees. Therefore, we are bringing food to the Horn of Africa or supporting peaceful negotiations that regulate the fair use of water in dry areas. The security of our life, of our freedom, and of our livelihoods. These dimensions of human security will be the basis of our national security strategy, which we are just writing for the whole government here in the Foreign Office. It will integrate internal and external aspects of security and will bring together policy areas ranging from disaster control to NATO planning. And it will include all actors with a view of defending human security. Because one thing is crystal clear, we will continue to rely on the work of the Advisory Board of Civilian Crisis Prevention. Because your experts' perspective and views matter, and they save life. I think one good example is Afghanistan, and this is why I'm so much in favor to also reflect what went wrong. Not to blame people, but to learn for the future. And with a systematic evaluation will help us to do and perform better in the future, also with your help. And therefore many of you have suggested such an assessment, and I'm very happy that 2 members of the Advisory Board, Hans-Joachim Giesmann and Winnie Nachtwey, are now part of the German Bundestag's Committee of Inquiry that will evaluate our involvement in Afghanistan. This will help us learn and become better at what we do. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank all of you for your expertise and also your critical but always constructive advice and your commitment. You all show there is indeed glory in prevention, because crisis prevention can save lives, not only in South Sudan, but also in Niger and Ukraine and here at home in Germany. With this in mind, I wish you all good discussions and thanks a lot for your engagement. Thank you.
Many thanks, Minister Baerbock, for this political support and for the issue of civilian instruments for crisis prevention and peace building, for the support to our advisory board, and for your understanding of human security, which you're planning to integrate in the national security strategy. So we hope our advisory board will stay a very good partner for informal advice or even critical debate and for knowledge sharing with civil society actors. We hope you can still stay a little longer with us and maybe listen also to the video from, yeah. Europe in the Shadow of War, this is our title today. And the first shock after Russian attack on Ukraine and the return of full-scale international war to Europe has passed. But continuously we have shocking events. The terrible human suffering inside Ukraine, 7.4 million refugees, 7 million internally displaced, and minimum of 6,000 civilian victims, and continuous war crimes and massive breaches of humanitarian law. Only in the last 2 to 3 months, the escalating implications for other regions of the world have become visible. The global crisis of food security, the rising energy prices, inflation are affecting even more the fragile situations outside our European media attention, like you mentioned Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa. So what has not passed since February 25th is the uncertainty about how to end this war and what could be elements of a new peaceful order in Europe. Our established instruments of conflict transformation maybe are not designed for this, and we will have our critical reflection today. But there is a strong commitment to financially and militarily support Ukraine, and a broad consensus that President Putin must not win this war. We will have a major expert conference in Berlin at October 25th, looking at Ukraine's reconstruction. But reconstruction is just one issue. What other possibilities for cooperation and new dynamic in the whole region can be promoted? So the candidate status for EU is an important sign for Ukraine and Moldavia. Is it also the answer to growing tensions in the Central Balkans? What about the Caucasus region and countries like Georgia and Armenia? And what are more elements at societal level to keep channels and contacts for a post-war order? To contribute to de-escalation in the region during the war, we have to explore the potential of negotiation on concrete issues. There is the negotiation on the crop exportations, maybe on a protection zone around the nuclear power plant. And what about the 1.5 million Ukrainian people abducted to Russia? Is this an issue of negotiation? What is the potential of documenting, persecuting war crimes to deter further human suffering? What is the potential to look for European solutions to energy crisis, taking into account the sustainable energy transformation? What is the role of historical narratives playing, and how can excluding narratives be changed? So there are just some questions for this conference and further on, and we want to not to forget lose sight of the implications of crisis prevention and peace building in other continents. So I pass over to my colleague here.
Thanks, Bodo. We need massive investment into civilian crisis prevention, mediation capacities, stabilization, and peace-building programs. Given the multiplicity of crises that we are currently witnessing, this is a tall order. Germany's willingness to invest in prevention amidst ongoing crisis will define its success as a change maker for peace. Without engaged prevention, there is no hope for a better future. Minister Baerbock, you have outlined today and in one of your speeches around the consultations of the national security strategy 3 main dimensions of security: the invulnerability of life, our physical safety, the freedom of life, our liberty of speech, and the protection of our basic needs, livelihoods, including a healthy environment. To maintain European security in the shadow of war, we need to recognize that these dimensions are deeply intertwined and that some of our own actions undermine the security of others, such as our fossil fuel consumption. In this Berlin Peace Dialogue, we address all 3 dimensions of security, acknowledging their interdependence. Peace and prosperity need intact ecosystems. Freedom of thought requires physical safety. If you fight for your survival because your land has been destroyed through direct acts of violence or the structural violence of climate change, your thoughts cannot be free. Your choices are not self-determined, but stirred by the storms that have come to define your life. Therefore, the Zeitenwende needs to be implemented in the zeitgeist of ecological restoration, not further destruction. The images of sabotaged pipelines releasing large amounts of methane into the atmosphere send shockwaves around the world. Not only are they antagonizing to watch for those who are barely able to pay their monthly gas bills and who worry about the winter, they're also devastating for those working on climate protection and who voluntarily reduce their fuel consumption. The energy crisis brought to light how dependent and vulnerable we are because of our fossil fuel use. The past summer, with its extreme heat and fires across Germany and extreme impacts like the flooding in Pakistan, just yesterday we saw a hurricane hitting Florida. These risks foreshadowed what types of risk we ought to prepare for in the future. In the midst of a war against Ukraine and ongoing health crisis and economic challenges, combating climate change and biodiversity collapse need to maintain on the agenda of policymakers, regardless whether they work on internal or external security, development, economics, or foreign affairs. Streamlining agendas such as climate protection or women's rights are integral parts of sustainable, systemic peace-building. As the Advisory Board on Civilian Crisis Prevention and Peace-Building, we want to be a partner for critical, reflective dialogue with the German government and share our expertise on different dimensions of conflict transformation. For the past 4 years, we as a team of 20 experts from wildly different backgrounds discussed and sometimes really wrestled over ongoing and looming crises and how to mitigate them. Many of us council members took home valuable lessons from these examples to our institutions. For this unlikely alliance and trusted partnership, I'm deeply thankful. Because in these complex crises, we need a multiplicity of perspectives to be able to navigate and prevail. Together, we published statements, reports, and hosted events on topics such as what role protection zones for civilians can play in hot conflicts, what climate security means for Germany, how can coherent peace policies be realized, or the interconnections between gender, peace, and security. Sadly, some topics gained relevance because of deepening crises. In other cases, there are glimmers of hope, such as the courageous resistance of Iranian women against the hijab mandate. With this conference, we seek to promote evidence-based discussions between civil society, policymakers, implementers, and scientists. To this, we invite you, who are gathered here today and who are zooming in through your screens, to actively ask questions and take part in the struggle for a peaceful, more just world. With these thoughts, I want to hand over to my fellow council members, Professor Hajo Giesmann, who was the driving force behind this development for the conference, and who will now walk us through the next part. Hajo, the floor is yours.
Dear Minister Baerbock, distinguished participants of this dialogue and the many listeners from near and far in the virtual space, the famous opposition leader of Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, we wanted her to address this audience today in person, but I think all of you can understand how difficult the situation is, particularly also for her country, which is run by a person who has himself allied with the Russian aggression of the Ukraine. I'm very happy that her deputy has found the time to come to us and will stay with us also for the panel and the subsequent discussions. All the more, we were pleased that she had accepted to talk to us virtually. I was able to have an interview with her the day before yesterday, so it's very fresh one. I want us to listen what she has to say. Just a few remarks about Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I'm sure everybody knows her, but just to make it short, she is a Belarusian educator, the head of the newly formed Unity Transnational Cabinet of Belarus, and is national leader of the opposition. She ran in the 2020 presidential elections as the main opposition candidate after her husband, Sergei, was arrested. She fled via Lithuania and is now organizing her effort to bring democracy to Belarus together with many compatriots from abroad. She was 2 times nominated as a candidate for the Peace Nobel Prize, and I can only tell you that I was really struck and fascinated by the interview that I had with her, and I invite you now to listen what she had to say.
So, Excellency, dear Mr. Tikhanovskaya, we are very honored that you are available for this interview within the framework of the Berlin Peace Dialogue 2022. Of course, we would like to have you in person with us, but you have a strenuous agenda, we know that, and we are happy that you give us some time to talk to us about the current situation in Europe. Let me start with a personal question. How difficult is it for you, being the head of the United Transitional Cabinet and being the national leader of Belarus, to be abroad, not to be on the ground in your country, and to work with your friends and comrades far from home to foster democratization-based transformation in your country?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I wish to thank the organizers of Berlin Peace Dialogue for organizing this event and for keeping Belarus on agenda. Let me thank to Annalena Baerbock and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Since 2020, we worked together and already achieved a lot. You asked how difficult it is to work from exile. Yes, it's difficult. Honestly, it's difficult to find strength every day to continue doing what we do. It's difficult not to fall into depression, in apathy. It's difficult not to give up. People are suffering and you can't actually physically help them. And of course, it's painful. But Belarusian people inspire me. To get strength, I'm thinking about heroic partisans, about our women with white umbrellas. They went to protest every day despite the fear of being arrested. And I'm thinking about, of course, my husband, who sent me a message of support from prison. He is at the moment in punishment cell since the 19th of August. But even from there, he somehow gives me this strength. And I'm getting inspired by, of course, the international community. When I meet presidents, parliamentarians, politicians, I feel that we are not alone. And of course, it gives me energy to go on.
The Berlin Peace Dialogue this year asked about the state and future of the European peace and security order in the shadow of Russia's attack on Ukraine. And in preparation and execution of which it is well known that the illegitimate ruler of Belarus was not uninvolved. So why have the hopes for freedom and democracy been fulfilled only in a few of the countries in the post-Soviet state, but not in all of them, including Belarus?
In Belarus, we had a difficult transition to democracy and market economy. After the Soviet Union collapse, Belarusians were not prepared to govern because for decades there was strong oppression from state. The policy was to control everything, and very little depended on people. And democratic institutions were rather weak, and they couldn't resist the ambitions of populist politicians. In addition, the economy during the early years of independence was very weak as well. And people wanted, at that time, like simple solutions. And one of them was to stick to Russia, which had more resources than others. And when Lukashenka ran for the office in 1994, the situation was exactly like this. He promised at that time to fix the economy through stronger economic and political ties with Russia. Actually, he won those first elections, but then immediately started to violate the constitution to establish an authoritarian regime. And since 1994, step by step, Lukashenko was dragging Belarus in the Russian sphere of influence. And 2022, the war against Ukraine became the result of many years anti-Belarusian policy of Lukashenko.
I come back to the war in a minute, but let me ask you the following. As well known, the president of the Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has repeatedly emphasized that the Ukrainian defensive war is essentially about defending democracy against autocracy. The predominantly autocratic rulers in Russia seem to resonate exactly with this assessment. Mm-hmm. Is the underlying dimension of the conflict possibly still underestimated in many places, particularly in the western part of Europe? Or is the Russian officials' rhetoric rather the revolt of a rotten empire whose ruling elites are worried about its continued existence?
This is exactly right. As we all know, democracies do not fight against democracies. Therefore, the commitment of the Western world to democracy is crucial, but it also needs consistency. We understand that every democratic rule is a work in progress, and that is why it's important to support democratic movement abroad, but also to pay attention to this inside democratic countries. At the same time, I wouldn't diminish the imperial sentiment in Russia. Unfortunately, this is still a phenomenon in Russia, and it's growing, especially when democratic institutions have been weakened and stopped doing their work. And those signals had been seen in Belarus and Russia since long, and they had to be taken seriously by the Western partners of Russia.
Do you have the feeling that the West is doing enough to support those in the post-Soviet space who are really willing to be a strong opposition against autocratic rule? Are we doing in the West the sufficient things, the right things? What is your perspective on that?
I'm sure that the West is doing much more than Kremlin expected, regarding this war in Ukraine. Ukraine has received a lot of help, and more would be needed. And I urge the EU, US, United Kingdom, and the other responsible nations to continue this support. But when it comes to Belarus, I cannot see yet how the West is going to implement its commitment to Belarus independence and sovereignty. The policy is in place and it is highly relevant, but practical steps are needed to help Belarusians preserve and defend their own independence and sovereignty.
If we look at what the dictator is doing and saying in Belarus, Lukashenka congratulated the Ukraine on the day of independence. Only a few days later, missiles were again fired at Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. And the other day, he has also expressed willingness to join the Russians in mobilizing Belarusian armed forces once Russian territory, after the fake reference, could become under fire. So what is the dictator doing? Is he playing a double game? And if so, what purpose does it serve?
Look, it's evident that Lukashenka is a cynical dictator who has lost the sense of shame. You know, he is supporting Putin in this cruel war of aggression against a peaceful neighbor. Without Lukashenka, this wouldn't be even possible, actually speaking. But he also wants to avoid responsibility for his crimes in Belarus and in Ukraine, for human rights abuses, for hijacking of airplane, for migration crisis. And this cannot happen. He must be put on trial. And actually now the investigation already can be started against the crimes committed by Lukashenko's regime.
This peace dialogue in Berlin is very much about civil crisis prevention, and we have to take a very self-critical perspective and reflection on what has happened in the past and what has failed. So if we look at the current security policy debates after the Russian attack on the Ukraine, the main issues are war and its possible determination, rearmament, arms race, sanctions, crisis management, economic consequences of related developments. So civil crisis management or civil crisis prevention and peace building seem to have completely fallen behind. Many of the approaches and instruments so far have been discredited, have failed, or were insufficient. Nevertheless, all reason teaches that peace is only possible through cooperation based on shared values. So what must or should be done by whom to return to the path of cooperation without sacrificing the values of democracy?
I would say that there is the recipe, cooperation on the basis of common values. Belarusians have made the choice for democracy, and we are willing to build a democratic nation that would be open for stronger relations with other democratic states. And this is the precondition for stable and safe Eastern Europe. Without democratic Belarus, the region will never be stable. There will always be a risk of new hijacked commercial planes, migration crisis, and attacks on peaceful neighbors. Belarusians are part of European family, and we should be given an opportunity to broaden this engagement. We need to be able to travel to the EU, especially amidst such challenging times. We want to participate in Eastern Partnership, and we want to be part of the new initiative of the European political community. Its values and focus are highly relevant for us.
And we all admire you in your aspirations and in your efforts. Your homeland, Belarus, bears huge but widely underestimated importance for the further development of the European peace and security order. The preservation of independence and the democratization of Belarus would be a hard blow for great Russian nationalism a la Putin and Medvedev, and this would possibly also have domestic political consequences across Russia itself. So in your view, can and will this succeed?
Belarus plays, to my opinion, a huge role both for Russia and for Europe. I believe that Free Belarus will be like the biggest sanction on Putin's regime, and it would be a clear indicator of its soon collapse. I believe that changes in Belarus might happen at any moment, even before changes in Russia. The recent successes of the Ukrainian army give us hope that it will be rather soon. In 2020, when Belarus protests started, Russian society was watching attentively. Belarusian resistance inspired Russians as well. And you could see Belarusian red, white flags at the protests in different parts of Russia. Perhaps it was one of the factors why Putin got scared and supported Lukashenka with money, with the army, even with propagandists. Because he realized if the peaceful democratic transition succeeds in Belarus, it can succeed in Russia as well. On the other hand, Belarus plays an important geopolitical but also symbolic role for entire Europe. The European project will not be finished without Belarus. Historically, our country belonged to Europe. Václav Havel believed that order of Belarus must be the border of Belarus must be the border of European Union, and instability in Belarus can cause instability in the entire region and vice versa. Democratic, independent, sovereign Belarus is in the interest of the entire Europe, and therefore I urge the entire European family to support us on this dangerous but promising path.
Thank you very much for sharing your insight and also sharing your optimism, which we would like to see also to materialize, not only in Belarus, but all across Europe. We wish you and all freedom-loving people of Belarus success in your efforts. Thank you very much, Mrs. Tikhanovskaya.
Thank you so much for your attention.
After this very encouraging and optimistic note, I would like to invite the panelists for the first panel to come here. Maybe you take your nameplates with you, just in case, to make yourself visible. And thank you, Minister, that you have found the time to come to us and for your brilliant note. Yeah. So, as you have heard already, this will be a bilingual panel. So our participants are free to choose the language of their preference. For those here in the room who need translation, the equipment is in the rear part of the room. And for those who are online, you have a translation button, or at least something technically visible that you can use to make use of the simultaneous translation. It's a pleasure to facilitate this panel with our distinguished participants. You see, there is no one from Germany but me, so it's really an international panel setting the stage for reflection from the outside on the instruments, approaches and tools of civil crisis prevention in the shadow of war and in a moment where the European peace and security order is at least in crisis, may be at risk to crumble. Before I introduce our panels, I will just explain how it will go. We will have, first of all, a round amongst us here on stage, but since that is a dialogue and we wish as many as possible participants to be actively involved, we will then also open the floor for questions and answers. But I urge you to keep your questions short. If you have a comment, even shorter, you will have the opportunity to go more into detail during the 4 workshops that will then take place after this panel, or more precisely after the lunch break, so that you are then refreshed for going to the workshop. A couple of preliminary remarks, though. When we chose the topic, Europe in the shadow of war, new challenges for civilian crisis prevention and conflict transformation for this year's Berlin Peace Dialogue, the beginning of the invasion by Russia's army was only a short time ago. In the meantime, the scale of crisis and global shake-up of the international order that this has triggered becomes more apparent with each passing day. While Putin and other Russian politicians are talking about the need for a new, quote-unquote, or quote-unquote alternative world order, thus tearing down the foundations of the existing world order, or at least considering it irrelevant for themselves, Russian troops are marauding on the territory of Ukraine just for the neo-imperial goal of the Russian leadership to annex territories of the neighboring countries and thereby forcibly changing European borders. With the announcement, and that is expected to happen today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, to consider conquered territory as Russia's own from now on, the possession of which is now to be maintained and defended by all available means, as they have said. Putin and his entourage are trying to rewrite history without regard for law and order, certainly not for the interest of others, and not even for the interest of many of their own Russian compatriots who are kept in the dark about the true interest of this raid. All of us are now experiencing a spiral of escalation with uncertain outcome. So what is clear, as the Chancellor has recently said and the Minister has also made clear, is that Russia must not profit in any way from its war of aggression. On the contrary, it must be held accountable for it, as it already increasingly is, politically, militarily, economically, and in the future according to criminal justice and reparations as well. In our discussion today, we want to ask ourselves how it could have come that the dictum of the quote-unquote unthinkable of another major European war did not hold despite recognizable early warning long time ago already. Did the idea of a collective peace order prove to be a pure illusion? Or is it crisis prevention that has failed? Moreover, what are the consequences that we have to deal with if we wish to return to the path of peace, building and security in this region? It entails the question about goals, preconditions, institutions, approaches of both peacekeeping and peace building, nationally, European, but also globally. Because as the Minister has said, even if it seems so at the moment, the variety of threats of civilian existence, buzzword human security, climate, etc., have not disappeared as a result of this war, but will only become more imminent and more acute in its shadow. So in addition to a self-critical reflection, understanding the requirements and exploring possibilities of civil crisis prevention is, among other things, one of the priority aims of this panel and of the entire Berlin Peace Dialogue this year. So now I wish to start with our work, and I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. If I may, I would like to start with Ambassador Heidi Grau, who is sitting on the left side of the panel. She is the Swiss ambassador to Georgia and the regional director of the Swiss Cooperation Office to the South Caucasus since last December. In 2021, she was appointed as special representative of the OSCE chair in the Ukraine and in the trilateral contact group, a position she had already in 2019. Before, she was head of the Human Security Department at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. That is the time where we have become acquainted to each other in person. Her assignments in the past had a frequent focus on Ukraine, among others as OSCE Swiss OSCE ambassador right after the Russian-led invasion in Crimea, and also as a special representative for the OSCE in the Ukraine. So, Mr. Ambassador, let me ask you the question that I already referred to in my introductory remark. Is the idea of a common peace and security in Europe from Vancouver to Vladivostok, that was the phrase used in the OSCE realm, is it an illusion, or has implementation become a failure?
Ja, besten Dank und guten Morgen allerseits. Ich freue mich.
Well, thank you very much.
Die Frage, die Sie
The question you have asked is difficult to answer because we're still in the midst of the logic of an escalation, as we've just heard from the foreign minister and from Ms. Tikhanovskaya. Possible forecasts or projections are very difficult given the present situation. Now, if we take a look back, you use this expression from Vancouver to Vladivostok, the common European house. This has a lot to do with the Paris Charter. 1990, that was at the time Yugoslavia still existed and the Soviet Union still existed at the time. At the time, people considered the Charter to be a watershed moment. Today, we speak of another watershed moment. At the time, it was a watershed moment in positive terms. These days, it is a watershed moment with a negative meaning. When we take a look at this Charter of Paris,
was speaking of a new era of democracy, peace and unity. It spoke about the time of profound change and historic expectations. And that might sound very naive today, but I think people that negotiated this charter were not naive at all. Because if we look into the details of what happened in the early 19th when it comes to also instrument tools, then we will see that there was also this was also the high time when some of the important confidence and security building measures were adopted. This was the high time of arms control with the treaty, the Conventional Armed Forces Treaty in Europe, with the Treaty on Open Skies, with the OSCE Vienna document. So I think this was not a naive moment, but rather the other way around. And we should also not forget CSC, so the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, but also OSCE. It was never a group of friends. There were also always very diverging interests. History could also have gone differently. But if we look at some of the problems that came up right after or already during the adoption of the Charter of Paris, we will see many conflicts. The war in the Balkans, Tajikistan, a civil war, Karabakh, Georgia in the early 90s had its wars, Chechnya not to be forgotten. What we often forget already then, we had clear signs of countries or governments, to be more precise, that were not ready to democratize their countries. They were not ready to live up to human rights standards they just adopted. So most notably probably the Central Asian countries. There was also no dealing with the past in each of the former Soviet republics, and I think that's very important also when we look at the situation today where history is being weaponized. So that was certainly one of the problems. If I can just quickly run through some of the other problems, because they are part of the answer to your question. Consent-based organizations such as the OSCE, of course, has big difficulties if you have countries that constantly are ready to break consents. Western Europe, I think there was too much focus on the European Union, too much focus on NATO, to the detriment of what could have been done in the OSCE. There has always been a pick and choose logic in the OSCE. It's an organization with a comprehensive security notion, but countries till today have been picking and choosing. Some found human rights more important, some found second dimension important, others were more into the more hard security aspects, but there were not many countries that really lived up to this idea of comprehensive security. They were already inbuilt in the Paris Charter and follow-up documents. There was this kind of constructive ambiguity. On the one side, it speaks about equal security, indivisibility of security. On the other side, it speaks about the freedom to choose your alliances. And that became a problem till today because there are different interpretations of these principles. So this is just to illustrate some of the problems that were there from the beginning, from the early 19th. And I think if we want to maintain this organization and its relevance, we have to look into these details. How can we deal with consent-based organization in times where we have several countries that are not ready to go along with the majority of participating states? What can we do when the budget depends on consents? So extra budgetary projects, more of them, but that means we need more money to be invested in OSCE. Is the will to do that? Is it there? Remains to be seen. A certain going back maybe even to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So more conference, less projects, or a combination of the two. I would see that as a potential future way. And still, I am convinced, and I hear it from colleagues in Vienna, that the Helsinki Final Act and its 10 guiding principles, this is still what should be the fundament of any living together in Europe. Of course, gravely violated, but I don't see any other fundament. So I'm still convinced that Europe can only exist with a cooperative security approach, even if it's extremely difficult today.
Yeah, thank you very much for this good start. I felt reminded when you said at the end that perhaps we should go to have more conference instead of projects. I thought at the first moment, okay, that brings us back to the early CSCE years where trust was not there, and the original trust building was very much based on dialogue, right? And maybe that is, on the one hand, an opportunity for the present situation, but on the other hand, we must also be self-critical enough to say it's a step back to a situation where apparently we have gone into the wrong direction. Thank you very much. My next panelist is Orysia Lutsiewicz. I hope this is correctly pronounced. Orysia is the head of the Ukraine Forum and research fellow in the Russia-Eurasia Forum at Chatham House in London, UK. Her research focus is on social change and the role of civil society in democratic transitions in the post-Soviet region. She is leading a new effort to design a resilience index on foreign encroachment. We would be very pleased to hear more about this. And in 2017, she coordinated a co-authored major Chatham House report, and the title was "The Struggle for Ukraine," which assessed changes since Euromaidan and has provided policy recommendation. She has authored numerous papers, publications, not only with the focus on Ukraine, but about the entire region, including Georgia, Moldova, and others. So my first question to you, Orysia, is Russians and Ukrainians were always looked at from, maybe only from the outside, as being relatives, brother peoples. That was the notion. And they have lived next to each other. They have even fought together against foreign invaders in history. But this war now seemingly has torn the two peoples apart. So what does this war to the long-standing and intertwined relationship between the people, the ordinary people on the two sides of the border?
Thank you very much, Hans-Joachim. It's quite a disturbing time to be at the peace dialogue when your country is being ripped off, and the UN Human Rights Council just confirmed that Russia is committing war crimes, and the list of those war crimes is quite disturbing, from the sexual violence for people between the age of 4 and 82 to indiscriminate attacks, the use of cluster munitions. Your question about people is important, because one of the misconceptions of this war and why many in the West thought Ukraine will fall fast, especially here in Berlin, we do know accounts of, including in the high offices, that what was the reason to help Ukraine if the country will be subjugated very soon, was exactly the invisible divergence between Ukraine and Russia that was taking place steadily since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was viewed from outside like Russia, but worse, more corrupt, more chaotic. And there was a big mistake that we make, and we should be very careful not to equate cultural proximity to a political culture. Ukraine's political culture, and that goes all the way to this nation that had a state for some time, but existed for very long as a nation without a state, is diametrically opposite to what Russia is. And exactly this political culture that carried throughout centuries. And we should be very careful now also not to abide to this Russian narrative that, you know, that Ukraine has, that everything Ukraine owes is to Russia, either it's imperial colonization or it's Soviet expansion. And I think you mentioned the resilience index that we are contemplating. We've done a paper on vulnerabilities and why Russia was able to create first crisis, then simmering conflict, then proxy war, and now a full-scale war. This is what we should be actually studying, which tools enabled Russia to move through these phases literally unpunished. Because believe me, they are using a lot of these tools against you. And why are we having, I believe, global rule-based order crumbling and collapsing? It's already collapsed. Let's not have an illusion. We'll have to build it from scratch, depending on how this war ends. But what we can already stand on, right? Because we need something to stand on in these dark times. We need that hope. And in Ukraine, 90% of people are confident that they can repel Russian aggression. And 60% in those dark times are optimistic about the future. And what gives that optimism is the sense of agency. And I think the sense of agency is something that can prevent future conflicts. And I just say briefly, because I know we can go deep into the discussion. First, vibrant civil society that was developing in Ukraine that is now able to provide humanitarian assistance much faster than any UN agency, that can document war crimes, that is skilled in collaborative governance. Ukraine had participatory budgets implemented in many communities where people had a say about what should be the priorities of local community. It's the capacity of local self-governance, and here, to the credit of Germany and Switzerland, invested a lot in building Ukrainian decentralization capacity. Today, these mayors have legitimacy, these mayors are trusted by their citizens, and they are on the forefront of sustaining civil services, administrative services to millions of Ukrainians. Digital. This is another thing that will help us come out of this. I think Ukraine is really the prototype of the future digital governance, and what you can do and how you can sustain services from driver license to ID cards when your population is on the move, when 1/3 of Ukrainians are living in panic, not knowing where their IDs are. If they have a cell phone, if they have internet connection, they can restore their identity. They can report the damage of the house. And something that is also perhaps invisible in our community is the whole use of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. We are not looking at this as part of development cooperation, but millions, believe me, millions were donated in weeks through cryptocurrency to support Ukrainians who were leaving so that they could have $50 a week to sustain their lives. And this was done in a flash of the light. Information awareness. Ukrainians throughout all those times were aware Russia uses and weaponizes information. So many communities were working to build critical thinking, to build internet use awareness among high school students. And finally, I think, why this war became possible is because Russian leadership, which is, let's be honest, 15 men from the security services captured Russia and made it unaccountable to their own citizens, brainwashed their population, dehumanized Ukrainians, now are dehumanizing the West and leading this European continent into the past. And I think if we want to make sure we prevent crisis in the past, we should never ever close eyes to what was happening inside Russia all those times, where we believed, especially in Berlin, that we could trade, build Nord Streams, and eventually Russia will democratize. This is a big lesson we should learn and look back at it. Because Ukraine was democratizing and going in this direction, Ukraine is standing, Ukraine will stand, and I'm sure Ukraine will win. And it will be the first rock of that future European security we cannot now even imagine. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I take from that it is important to be more attentive, to look more in depth into the political and social fabric of a society, to understand what the underlying driving forces are of the social and political development. That is, so politics does not take place only on track one. Politics is resonating or reflecting also what is happening within the society and the other way around. And that is something where I have to learn, or where we can learn also from the current development in the Ukraine that you have described. Now, the third panelist is, I mentioned the name already, is Valery Kovalevsky, who is the deputy head of the Unity Transitional Cabinet, it's a complicated name, of Belarus, and in charge for the foreign policy department. So you are the foreign policy advisor also of your national leader. His background is diplomacy. You've been a diplomat in the past, right? You formulate the foreign policy priorities for the cabinet. You also develop international engagement for the sake of democratic change in Belarus. And before joining the team of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, you have worked at the World Bank in Washington, right? Now, Valery, the conflict between autocracy and democracy, that is apparently what is at stake. At least, or apart, or in addition to the imperial territorial claims that are made on the Russian side. What I am struggling with, and I would like to ask you, how come that apparently the appeal of democracy, the democratic value, has somewhat fading away, has been somewhat fading away in the recent years in all across Europe. It's not only in Russia. We have seen also what is happening in Italy. We see what is happening in Hungary. We see what is happening in Turkey, etc. So there is apparently a growing tendency to strive for simple solutions of complex problems, right? So the question for me is, how could the appeal of democracy be brought back into the societies that are now confronted with this increasingly autocratic rule in their countries?
Thank you, Professor, and a good question for somebody who practices fighting against dictatorship. This is my daily job, not just fighting for freedom, but also against the dictatorship in Belarus. I would like to argue against this premise that the appeal of democracy is decreasing. And the best examples of this are Belarus and Ukraine. Belarusians have shown that they would prefer a democratic choice, even though this has not been our reality for almost 3 decades, while Lukashenka has been in power. But nevertheless, Belarusians in 2020 chose to vote for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, chose to vote for a democratic future of Belarus, and they have been rather consistent in insisting that there is no place for dictatorship in Belarus any longer. When we look at Ukraine, this is a clear example how much more effective democratic society is against a dictatorship, Russia, which is a much more formidable military power, so it seemed before the war. But it is the democratic society in Ukraine, the cohesion of the society, the democratic values, the understanding of the direction for the country, and a very close connection between the state and the people of Ukraine. This is the one now, and this is why Ukraine is so resourceful. This is why it is persevering in this uneven fight. So I think that the value of democracy and its appeal and its practical impact is there for us. And yes, we understand that in some countries who have been rather accustomed to living in democratic society, it seems like everything has been pre-settled and there is no need to worry any longer. And this is something that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya mentioned in this commentary for you, that you also need to work on democracy inside your own countries. Because this is a work in progress and it takes a lot. At the same time, I would point to the connection between the collapse of democratic institutions that happened in Belarus and how much it can affect regional security. The crisis in Belarus became sort of an unresolved problem for Eastern Europe, for the European Union. And in spite of the efforts that have been applied to support Belarusians in this fight, Lukashenka managed to stand the ground, also because of the support from Putin. And that was for the reason. He needed this kind of ally, and Putin supported Lukashenka in the most difficult of times in order to use him, to instrumentalize him later. And what we saw in 2021, the space that had been left to Lukashenka and Putin was effectively used. We saw Ryanair flight hijacking. We saw migration crisis that was engineered right before our eyes in order to inflict damage on the EU. The tactic of Lukashenka has always been, I will create a problem for you, and then I will sell you a solution to this problem. And luckily, we saw that the EU managed to stand the ground, not buying into this trick from Lukashenka. But the crisis in Belarus has become the breeding ground for the war in Ukraine. Without this unresolved crisis, this war would not happen at all, or would be very, very much different, because Lukashenka has provided territory of Belarus to Russians. And that was the main thrust of the attack in the early days of the war, to capture Kiev, to inflict damage on the central power, central government of Ukraine. So this makes Lukashenko complicit in the act of aggression against Ukraine, and this makes him liable for what has been done inside Belarus, but also for the war crimes in Ukraine. So what's necessary to do at this point of time to bring up the appeal of democracy in those countries that are already democratic or are aspiring to be democratic? I think that it is necessary to make it worthwhile for the societies and understand what are the practical outcomes of this transition. At the moment, for example, Belarusians are receiving a lot of support. The protests, as much as they have been unprecedented, they also received unprecedented support from the European Union, international community in general, but it has not been enough. We've seen that this work has not been completed. This support has been sort of intermittent, sometimes late, sometimes somewhat off. But let's say here in Germany, a year ago, 3 parties concluded coalition agreement. And there was a very explicit language on Belarus, which means aid for democratic forces, pressure on the regime, and also preventing interference of Russia in Belarusian affairs. And so I can commend only the 3 parties for adopting a language that was highly relevant then and continues to be relevant today. At the same time, we don't see that this policy has been underpinned by many practical steps from German government. I think there's a lot of space still to fill this with practical solutions, with practical support, with pressure on the regime, but also with the acts to put off the interference from Russia. For example, one of the instruments that Lukashenka and Putin have used during all these times is to sign agreements that bring Belarus much closer under the control of Russia. Nobody disputes that. Everybody is watching this space and is like, This is bilateral, we cannot interfere. Even though Lukashenka lost legitimacy, he does not have the power of attorney from Belarusian people to sign such agreements. If we sort of develop this trend between Lukashenka and Putin, we could come to a situation of the referenda in Ukrainian territories. And this is exactly the prospect that Belarusians are facing, that sooner or later there will be another referendum between Lukashenka and Putin saying like, Belarus will become part of Russia. So what would be the response from the West? Like, we do not recognize this, we dispute this, we condemn this. It might be a bit too late for that. So let us think if we can provide some early response to what's going on already now. In 2021, Russia established 2 military training centers in Belarus without any consideration, without any consultation with Belarusian people. 28 integration roadmaps were signed to bring Belarus closer in all possible governance sectors to Russian control. This has been left unnoticed completely, kind of, by the West. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Important remarks, and thank you also for picking up my provocation about the appeal for democracy. I read a poll, and maybe many of us are aware of that. I think it was released yesterday, that in Germany only 30% of the population in the eastern part of the country are still fond of democracy. So what I wanted to say is, it is not an eternal given. Right? One has to take care of it. If it is a building block of peace and human security, I think it's important to take care of democracy as that. No, thank you very much for your point. I'm very pleased and happy to have Alice Bahumi Mogwe with us. I'm so sorry. She is a lawyer and activist, the founder and the director of the human rights organization. Now it becomes even more complicated, Ditshwando, okay, based in Botswana, the Botswana Center for Human Rights, just to translate it. In 2019, she was elected as president of the International Federation of Human Rights, I think a term which comes to an end this year, right, next month. But I'm sure you will not step out of humanitarian rights work. Her work is focusing on protecting political freedoms, ensuring rights for minorities, women, children, LGBTQ people, migrants, refugees. So all those marginalized people, very often pushed aside in societies across the entire social spectrum. And last year she was awarded the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's Human Rights Award. She has received numerous other awards. I do not want to list them all. But the reason that you are on the panel is very much about Europe being a part of a global space. And this war and the crisis of the European and security order has effects that go far beyond the boundaries of Europe, and which have effects, of course, also on the rather civilization issues that the minister has mentioned in the morning, but have also a detrimental effect on the situation of people in countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I was very pleased by the minister when she said that security is human security, and it's freedom, right? And I think you are representing here on the panel people who are fighting for it under very difficult positions outside Europe. So the question I have is, what does the current crisis do to the people in your region? Are you concerned that Europe being pushed back into geopolitics will have a detrimental effect on the SDG for the African countries, for your society? Are you concerned that Europe could turn back its face from the problems in your country, and what is in general your concerns? Share, please, your opinion on that with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start with just a line from a poem by T.S. Eliot. It's one of my favorite poems. It's from the Four Quartets. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. So you've guessed it. My focus tends to be on the historical narrative, and also looking at the effects of relationships. We're very aware that there has been a lot of outcry about the seeming non-positioning of Africa. I'm not here representing the continent of Africa, but really just here to share some reflections in terms of observing what has been happening. And I think what is incredibly important is to not forget the effects of our history. Africa has had relationships with Europe in terms of Europe turning its face towards Africa or turning its face away. But it starts, of course, from the colonial period, where we had resources from Europe. The development cooperation has really gone through various phases, through the colonial, through the Cold War period, and what some have said is a post-Cold War period. Question which I've been asking is whether the Cold War ever really ended. And the reason I ask this is that when we look at the multilateral institutions, or looking at discussions in the global space, for those of us looking from the outside, the schisms which were there appear to be re-emerging with different names. But then again, one needs to look at where Africa sits. We have an institution called the non-alignment movement, which was set up in the 1950s, 1960s, really by those countries which were recently independent and were focused on fighting for the independence of countries from colonial powers. And a part of the commitment of those countries was to really not be swallowed up by the East-West Cold War dynamic. And that, in some way, explains the positioning which quite a few African countries have taken in terms of abstaining when it came to votes at the UN. However, there has been, and the South African Minister of Foreign Affairs has spoken to this, and did also make the point of speaking about the need for recognizing what is happening to people in Ukraine. And I'd like to just share her quote. Minister Naledi Pandor said, and this is on the 8th of August, just as much as the people of Ukraine deserve their territory and freedom, the people of Palestine deserve their territory and freedom. And we should be equally concerned at what is happening to the people of Palestine as we are with what is happening to the people of Ukraine. Now that is coming from a position, as I spoke about the non-alignment movement, I talk about the colonial histories and the relationships, and your past does influence your positioning and how one views the world. Most recently, Africa's experience in relation to European development cooperation and engagement is the COVID vaccine hoarding, the COVID vaccine, what was sometimes called nationalism. So the most recent experiences have not been particularly positive. We also saw discriminatory treatment towards black students when they were trying to leave Ukraine to return to their countries. And this resulted in the African Union issuing a statement of concern. When we talk about migration, and you made reference to the work we're doing with migrants and refugees, we're also seeing a Europe which is becoming more inward-looking, focusing on containment policies in relation to migration, focusing on extending European borders into other countries in Africa. And so, yes, we are observing, are concerned, because what happens in Ukraine will of course affect people. We're already seeing rising food prices, there are concerns in relation to fuel, etc. And so we've had the UK minister, Vicky Ford, who was then minister, saying for far too long, African countries have endured the fallout from global forces outside their control. And so yes, Professor, I would say we are observing what is happening in Ukraine. We are concerned about what is happening in Ukraine, but really have been struck by what in the South we see sometimes as contradictory double-standard approaches to issues which affect those communities living outside Europe, or those who also would require their human rights to be protected. This is not to say that it therefore justifies the action which Russia is doing, but I think it's incredibly important to distinguish between understanding through analysis, understanding the explanation of why things happen, and then focusing on whether those actually justify the action which is then taken. And I think for a lot of people in the South, they have been looking at the voting pattern at the UN. It's been a very interesting observation to make. I'll pause there. However, but I did want to add just a few more questions. What does winning this war look like? It's a question I've been pondering. And what does losing the war look like? And what does peace look like for Europe? And I'd be really interested to hear from fellow panelists in terms of how are we conceptualizing that? Because once we're clear about where we're trying to get to, the strategies then become a little bit easier, and also focusing on how to build sustainably. And I very much like the comment you made about really relying on the people themselves, community, civil society, civil organizations, for peace building, sustainable peace building. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Orysia wants to ask one question.
I don't want to disrupt too much of our... Okay. But you know what struck me, and maybe it's just a question, we can discuss it. You still juxtaposition the attitude or policy of Global South versus West or United States, rather than what is our policy towards Ukraine. Imagine there is no European Union. Imagine there is no America. What is the Global South doing? Is this just humanitarian assistance, or are we taking a stance on actually our position vis-a-vis Russia, perhaps acknowledging what happened inside Russia throughout all this time? So it's interesting because this is still present. Like you say, it's there. Why it's the first thing you are comparing yourself to?
I think this is the question I was asking, did the Cold War ever really end? And that is the question which I'm saying provides a prism through which people are looking at the world from the South. Because, and I gave examples of treatment of people from the South and being the recipients of actions and decisions taken elsewhere. Climate change, for example, is another example, and so one can go on and on about that.
Yeah, thank you very much also for this beginning discussion, which I hope will also inspire our participants in due course of the event today. One point that I wanted to make, based on what you have said, is that it's not only the question if the Cold War has not ended for the people living in the South. It is also the question of making use of the South for geopolitical rivalry in the North. And this is nothing that has happened or has started with the attack on the Ukraine. It has never ended, right? It's the Chinese and others who offer altruistic economic support but have their own political interests. So it's also important to look at the motivations to provide support in your region. And it brings me, of course, to Cesare, and ich gehe jetzt ins Deutsche hinein.
I will now switch to German. After the Second Vatican Concilium, the Christian community of Sant'Egidio has been founded with its headquarters in Rome. Cesare Zucconi is the Secretary General. They also have an office in Germany, here in Berlin. It's a network of communities, a low-profile organization with strong roots in Africa. And when I prepared for the panel, I found an interview you gave to Dom Radio, I think, and when your founder received a prize, you spoke about humanitarian corridors, and Alice just pointed out that humanitarian corridors and the acceptance of such humanitarian corridors might be waning, and is also a symbol when we look to Ukraine of what we currently witness. So what can organizations like Sant Egidio do to keep these corridors open, and how effective are you in influencing civil society in the countries that are directly affected, and also in countries of destination, and also in countries of origin when we speak about migration? Yes, I will be speaking German to highlight the Italian-German friendship, if I may say so. So, thank you for the invitation. Yes, you spoke about humanitarian corridors. That is an initiative that started in 2015 already in Italy. Back then we had and still have the Syrian war and the Syrian crisis, many refugees trying to reach Europe, who fled from war. And of course Italy is a Mediterranean country. And unfortunately, these days we are again watching so many people dying at sea. They are looking for rescue, but they drown. And as has been said before by Ms. Mogwai, the doors to Europe are rather shut. It is very difficult to enter Europe legally and in a safe way, also for people who are haunted by severe crises and war situations at home. So our question was, how can we provide safe and secure passage to Europe for people fleeing from war? We spoke with the Italian government and found an article in European legislation that, let's say, offers a legal framework for this initiative. So our idea was, we are concluding an agreement with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, and as a civil society organization, together with other NGOs, we will open these safe passages. We went to Lebanon in the first place, where we are still active today, and the Italian government gave us several thousands of humanitarian visa. We identified the people, the police authorities checked their identity, and of course established criteria of vulnerability, and also looked at their willingness to integrate themselves into European society. And then we sent them to Italy on planes. And that is special again. And you mentioned this, all these people were not hosted by the state, but by civil society. So they are not taken care of in state structures, but Italian families are hosting Syrian families. Organizations and associations organize this, and this helped with the integration of these people. Of course, there is some guidance and support of Sant'Egidio and other organizations involved in the process, but this really made sure that integration happens faster and more effectively. The children go to school immediately, the adults will learn the language immediately, you're looking for a job, you are of course looking at possible health problems. So these are very effective structures, and I think when facing such challenges, that are so complex, that are global. And migration and refugees are such a global problem. You also need to involve civil society. We need the creativity, if I can put it that way, and the creativity, the imagination in civil society, and the model to bring thousands of people from Lebanon, then from Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. And the minister spoke about the severe crisis at the Horn of Africa. People in South Sudan were also involved. We had a cooperative project with South Sudan. We are working for peace in South Sudan in cooperation with the Foreign Office here in Germany. And last but not least, we also opened some corridors from Afghanistan and also rather Pakistan, from Libya, an often forgotten situation where people really live in camps like slaves without any possibility of a life in dignity. So let's say it was sort of a best practice model. France and Belgium are also on board now, and it shows that you can open up such passages. They are safe, they are legal, and help with quick, effective integration. And of course, with regard to Ukrainian refugees, it is a bit of a different story here. Sant'Egidio has been active in Ukraine since 1991. We have several thousands of members in Ukraine who from the beginning have been very active in showing solidarity, helping in Ukraine, also worried about the unity of Christians in that country, because this also needs to be addressed. The separation between the Orthodox Christians in that region is a scandal, and unfortunately that also helped with the other factors of division. But in this crisis, we see that many of our Ukrainian members are very active in hosting and supporting people who are internally displaced. There are so many IDPs there, and I really admire the courage and the resilience shown by these people, especially by the women, I have to say. Women in Ukraine, people in Ukraine who in this very difficult situation really show that solidarity is our answer in that war, solidarity in Ukraine, because solidarity also is something from which the future can grow. We also need to think about the future. What will the future look like? Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it's absolutely certain that we all understand how difficult the work of Sant'Egidio is and also how complicated it is. There is a number of organizations that try to be active, that are active in terms of mediation. And I think it's not that visible all the time. It's rather happening in the background, but I think it's very important because it really aims at not only improving humanitarian security and opening space for that, but also changing patterns of behavior and mindsets. In the end, it's people who shape the situation. And I hope we can sum up with a brief round between all panelists. Heidi Grau. I don't know if we should be speaking German or English. I think it doesn't really matter. Your really intimate knowledge of the OSCE, I mean, the big elephant here in the room is Russia. Russia is is a participating state of the OSCE, to be precise, and it's the only organization for the whole of Europe after they quit, they left the Council of Europe, in which issues like democratic development in Russia can be addressed. Russia is not only Putin and Medvedev and Rogozin. Russia also means Navalny and many people taking to the streets these days, showing courage of protesting, even though they know that they will be sanctioned. Media representatives, civil society representatives. The question is, what can such an organization do in order to give these people hope that Russia can be part of the European family in the future at some point? If we want change in Russia, I think it needs to come from the inside. Anything else is hard to imagine in a rational way. Well, it's not an easy question, but I will try to give an answer. Over the last days, a presidency conference has taken place about human rights and democratization. That was basically the version of the human dimension implementation meeting that existed before. So I am convinced that it is very important for the organization itself, but also for Russian members of the Russian opposition, that such events continue to take place. It was possible to do this by using a sort of a trick. We did something really creative, because normally the hosting of this conference would have needed a consensual decision. Russia would have needed to agree to the program and the date, but the Polish presidency of this of the organization this time said, we want this meeting to take place, and labeled it a conference of the presidency, and that does not require a unanimous decision. So within the OSCE, there are possibilities to continue to host such meetings. It was a very good meeting, I have to say. My colleagues told me 1,500 people participated, coming from all regions of the OSCE, and Russian human rights activists were also present. So everything that helps. Well, it really reminds us of the times of the Cold War, where these people-to-people meetings are essential, and the organization can have certain projects and events to facilitate that. But in general, it will be important that Europe, Western Europe, is able to take decisions in a way that Russian activists are not excluded, that they can continue to travel to Europe, that Russia still continues to see how democracy works, why democracy is attractive, and why what we have in our countries is the better form of government. And when I listened to what Alicia said, she gave us basically a lesson in resilience. And
what does it take to make more populations, more people in the OSCE space as resilient as the Ukrainian people is now? And this indeed, I think the OSCE has certain tools to support such activities, but in the end it really has to come from within. It's the society that has to get organized.
I think that's very, very important. I take from that also for our dialogue in the afternoon that how to be creative in exploring instruments that are appropriate or that can help really to overcome the crisis, and secondly, how to organize people-to-people exchanges that are necessary in order to not to leave the space to propaganda or other tools of information which have a different.
Maybe one additional element. I think it's really very important that we in the OSCE, but in general in Europe, that we do not focus uniquely on Russia. I mean, you explained it very nicely. Ukraine has always been treated through the Russian perspective. And that goes for many other countries. It goes for Belarus, it goes for Ukraine, of course, it goes for Central Asian countries, it goes for my region now of duty, Caucasus. I think more attention is needed, should be dedicated to these post-Soviet countries, and very often it remains lip services.
Very good point. I come to you now, Orisha. You can respond to that, or you can reflect on that if you wish. But academics sometimes read what other academics write, and so I have found in one of your papers.
That's very scary.
The following: Putin weaponized history by giving it a function, and I think that is an important point. We heard that in the morning also from the two speakers about the role of narratives. Could you reflect also on that, or explain what has brought you to this insight?
Well, I think Putin weaponized pretty much everything until he had to resort to a nuclear blackmail, right? I mean, I think, and we've perhaps taking it too lightheartedly, but Putin is basically accusing Ukraine of crime, of wanting to exist as a nation, and he is rewriting a history which, you know, a famous historian, Timothy Snyder, said, analyzing Putin's historical essays, it's like being a zoologist in a butcher shop. This is not history. This is actually part of a Putin doctrine, to which I think we must understand what is it. There's a lot of discussion in Ukraine whether Russia is a fascist state, whether Russia is Nazism state, whether it's a certain Russian invention, and what is it. And I think we should listen now to Ukrainians carefully because they're living through it. And I will point your attention to this infamous article that appeared on RIA Novosti, as if everything was supposed to go according to the plan, how Russia solved the Ukraine question. This should be taken seriously. This is the part of Putin's doctrine. And when you ask how victory looks, or how we can open a different future, is that we have to ensure that this doctrine fails. And that means, weaponizing history, weaponizing information, brainwashing Russians, brainwashing here in the West, using RT, using social media to break societies, to actually to make us see world through Putin's eyes, to make his narrative our narrative about the world. And we have to absolutely reject that and make sure it fails. And, there's a lot of discussions about what kind of future actually this could bring to Russia. And because we're here in Germany and because of war crimes that are taking place, the first thing Ukrainians will tell you, to have any future for Europe, there has to be justice and there has to be Russian acceptance of guilt. I know that some German foundations were already going before this war to Germany to talk about Stalin's crimes. But they said, what kind of crimes are you talking about? There is a historical continuity between Imperial Russia, Soviet Union, Putin's Russia, and today's war. It's a very clear pattern, and Russian people, intellectuals, Russian opposition has to take responsibility for this. They will not be able to fudge it. Ukrainians say that Putin is mainly responsible for war, but 54% of Ukrainians say Russians are responsible for war. They are complicit. They are taking part, they are approving this war, and will not be able to avoid these difficult questions for the future of Russia. And that means also something very important, actually reform inside Russia towards more federal state, like they claim to be. They claim to be a federal state. They want Ukraine to be a federal state, but they are not a federal state. So I hope it also with future Russian leaders, whoever comes, there will be a serious discussion about federalization and democratization of Russia, because they are taking resources from Dagestan, Buryat, Yakutia, putting them as fodder fire, extracting oil and gas, doing exactly imperial policy within Russia to their own indigenous populations, and killing Ukraine. This is what is going on. And we should ask these questions to Russian opposition and Russian intellectuals. Are they accepting this as a reality, or they disagree?
Yes, thank you. We are a bit running out of time, so I hope that we can conclude the second round. Valery, you said that possibly more of announcement to annex territories can be expected, and that is exactly what the UN ambassador, the Russian UN ambassador, has announced that yesterday or day before yesterday in the at the meeting of the Security Council. So. How to, I mean, the question for me here is, you as a former diplomat, now in a very ambivalent position, talking not only to other diplomats, but also talking to members of the Belarusian society and other international actors. What do you think about multi-track diplomacy? Do we need more of multi-track diplomacy if at the track 1 level people try to drop out? If they are not ready to talk at all, right? But at the same time, this kind of communication is desperately needed in order to manage the current crisis. So is there anything that you can contribute from your recent experience, how that can work, this kind of multi-track diplomacy in practice?
Yeah, this is an issue for us as well. Since Belarusian democratic forces and the society from the very start said, like, we want to have dialogue to resolve the crisis in Belarus in peaceful manner, through compromise, through dialogue. But what we have seen is complete intransigence of the regime with this regard. Like, they just ignore these calls. Instead, they prefer to use violence, to use brutality, lawlessness. And we just came to the conclusion that the only leverage over them is to put more pressure and to be resolute and to be forceful and to be practical. And this is unfortunately what has been missing at times. Like, the first package of real sanctions came in 10 months after the elections happened and the protests started. By then, protests have essentially been destroyed. Lukashenka has managed to, jointly with Putin, managed to stand the ground. And the actual sanctions came not in response to the crisis in Belarus, but because of the Ryanair flight hijacking. So it was about the interests of Europeans, not about the crisis in Belarus, which was frustrating. Americans introduced the first package of sanctions exactly in 1 year. And the next strong package of sanctions came because of the migration crisis. Again, not because of the internal crisis in Belarus. So multiple tracks might be useful, but let us think about the most impactful methods and approaches, something that any dictatorial regime is afraid of. This is being forceful, this is being resolute, this is being practical in their steps. And something I would also like to go slightly back to what Arisa was saying about what happens to Russia. Does it have future in the European family? I have not seen any clear signals from democratic forces of Russia that they would abandon this imperial policy. They would abandon this lookout at their neighbors as temporarily independent territories. There has not been such conversation yet. No manifesto, no declaration, no commitment, whether serious or not serious, like they're just flowing with the flow. So we need to make sure that Russians are actually willing to stick, to adhere to the principles and values of the European family. Instead, at this point of time, let us not forget about those who crave to be part of the European family, who are part of the European family by default, by being in Europe. And this is Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus. Let us make specific steps to support their cause, to support their call for being part of this family.
Yeah, thank you. We are now really close to the end of this panel, but I do not want to let Alice run away from this discussion without asking her about we Europeans often think we know all the instruments, right? Civil crisis prevention. And it is us going around the world telling others how good those instruments are. I have learned in Africa and also in other regions of the world that others are also very creative, sometimes even more creative than we are. Is there anything that you would give us as an advice about what we can learn from your work in Africa for civil crisis prevention?
I think it's really important to be contextual. Because as you're suggesting, there's often a cut and paste, because some things worked in country A or crisis A, it's going to work in crisis B. And often that doesn't work. And the question needs to be, are we grafting or are we imposing or are we integrating? And I cannot stress contextualizing more than I have. The place of the community, the place of customary practices, those are really important. I listened to the minister this morning speaking about the Spear case. And what I would have liked to have found out was what had pre-existed the legal system to which she referred. Because she spoke about the judge, etc., and what the UN is doing. Where the UN is absent, how are these conflicts solved? And we so often fall into the trap of imagining that there's some void which exists before the savior arrives, in whichever form the savior comes. And therefore, that would be my word of advice, is that we should not become self-prophesying saviors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would open the floor and ask for questions. There should be somewhere a mic, I guess. So I see two people in the second row.